Have you ever wondered why everyone loves Vikings? It's been decades since the release of the first movie starring Kirk Douglas as a fearsome Viking invader, and still today we are obsessed with all things Norse. We have shows like Vikings and Valhalla, books like the best-selling The Last Kingdom series and Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which takes place during the Viking Age, not to mention that Marvel has adopted them as well. If you ask most people, they probably associate Vikings with ferocious warriors wearing horned helmets who pillaged and murdered their way across Europe. So why do we love hearing about them so much? Well, because the reality was far more fascinating than any Hollywood blockbuster could ever hope to be. Let's start by talking about their ships. You see, when most people think of Viking ships, they imagine these long, low, flat-bottomed boats filled with fierce warriors eager to plunder coastal villages. But this couldn't be further from the truth. Viking ships were marvels of engineering, not just among their contemporaries, but even compared to modern standards. They built ships called nares that had 3 masts with square sails, making them capable of traveling across the North Sea in a matter of days, something the average 21st century vessel would struggle to match. The Vikings also invented the efficient and durable clinker-built method of boat construction, where planks overlap instead of being side by side, which added extra strength and stability. In fact, many of their ships could carry over 100 tons of cargo, or up to 60 fully armed men. The Vikings used these ships for exploration, trade and warfare, but mostly for transporting goods. And when it comes to discovering new lands, the Vikings were right up there with the likes of Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan. We've already covered how the Vikings discovered America nearly 500 years before Columbus in another video, but let's go even further. The Vikings traveled all the way to the Middle East, Africa, and even Asia. One of their favorite destinations was the Byzantine Empire, where the wealth was immense and the emperors would pay handsomely for Viking mercenaries. And what did the Vikings do with their ill-gotten gains? Well, they spent it on luxury items like silk, spices, and perfumes from the Middle East and Northern African empires. And they weren't just buying things for themselves either. The Vikings had a thriving merchant class that transported these luxuries back home to sell for a profit. To put it simply, the Vikings weren't one-dimensional raiders. They were skilled mariners, merchants and traders who knew their way around the world and weren't afraid to travel vast distances. But while the Viking warrior is often portrayed as a bloodthirsty killer, the reality was far more nuanced. The Vikings didn't just attack anyone they came across. Instead, they focused their raids on monasteries and small villages near the coast. And why was that? Because they didn't want to get into big wars with established powers like the Frankish or Byzantine empires. They just wanted easy targets that would give them what they needed and leave them alone afterwards. The Vikings had their own code of conduct when it came to warfare, and they preferred to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. For example, they would often give their enemies the chance to surrender and save themselves from violence. And if they were outnumbered, they would retreat rather than fight a losing battle. It wasn't all about killing and destruction like Hollywood would have you believe. Sometimes they actually preferred diplomacy. Don't forget that they formed alliances with the people they traded with, and some Vikings even converted to Christianity and became missionaries themselves. There were even a number of female rulers during the Viking Age, such as Queen Sigrid the Haughty of Sweden, who ruled over her kingdom in the 960s. But let's take a closer look at Viking society now. What made them tick? What did they believe in? The Vikings were a polytheistic people with a rich mythology that has had a lasting impact on literature, art, and popular culture. They worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, including Thor, Odin, and Freya, who embodied the values and beliefs of the Viking people. The Vikings believed that their gods were powerful and unpredictable, just like the forces of nature that they relied on for survival. This belief system shaped their worldview and influenced their daily lives, from the clothes they wore to the tattoos they painted on their bodies. And don't forget about the mead halls, which were more than just a place to drink and party. They were social hubs where people could exchange news, make deals, and settle disputes. The mead hall was also a microcosm of Viking society, with its hierarchy of warriors, craftsmen, and servants. But let's talk about Viking women now. They were not the helpless damsels in distress that you might find in other cultures. In fact, they were pretty badass. Viking women were involved in almost every aspect of their society, from managing households to participating in religious rituals and even leading armies. They also enjoyed more rights than women in most other European cultures at the time. For example, they could own property, make contracts, and even divorce their husbands if they so chose. But don't get it twisted. Viking women were not equal to men. They were expected to fulfill traditional gender roles and were often confined to domestic duties. However, they still had more freedom than their counterparts elsewhere. And it was not uncommon for a Viking woman to own property or to engage in trade. In fact, there were even female Viking warriors known as shield maidens, who fought alongside men in battle. While this may sound like a Hollywood invention, there is evidence that shield maidens were a real part of Viking culture. Sagas often refer to female warriors who fought bravely in battle, and archaeological finds have uncovered female armor and weapons that suggest that they were an integral part of Viking society. So while it's true that Viking women were primarily responsible for domestic duties, they were far from the helpless creatures that you might find in other cultures. They were strong, independent, and capable individuals who played an important role in their communities. Okay, here's a question for you guys. Do you think the Vikings were glorified barbarians or highly sophisticated people? Let us know your thoughts. Now, we can't talk about the Vikings without mentioning their art. Now, this isn't your typical type of art. These guys didn't paint pictures or sculpt statues. No, their art form was their everyday lives. From the intricate patterns they carved into their weapons to the vibrant colors they chose for their tapestries. Everything was a form of self-expression for the Vikings. Their art wasn't just beautiful to look at either. It was a way for them to communicate their beliefs and values to the world around them. Take, for example, their runic inscriptions. These carvings weren't just decorative. They were a way for Vikings to record their history, their genealogy, and their personal stories. Runes were also used as a form of magic, with some people believing that they could ward off evil spirits or bring good luck. Another popular art form among the Vikings was metalwork. They were skilled goldsmiths and silversmiths, creating intricate pieces that were highly prized throughout Europe. Viking jewelry was especially famous, with pieces often incorporating animal motifs and intricate knotwork. The Vikings also loved to decorate their homes with art. From the furniture to the walls, everything was a canvas for them. They created textiles with bold colors and patterns, as well as wooden carvings that depicted scenes from their everyday lives. All of this goes to show that the Vikings weren't just a bunch of rough and tumble warriors. They were a highly creative and expressive people, who used art as a way to connect with each other and the world around them. And finally, let's discuss the legacy of the Vikings. They left behind a rich cultural heritage that continues to influence the world today. Their language, Old Norse, is the ancestor of modern Scandinavian languages, and their mythology has inspired countless works of literature, film, and art. But perhaps the most important thing that the Vikings left behind is their spirit of adventure and exploration. They were a curious and adventurous people who were not afraid to venture into the unknown. And this spirit continues to live on in the modern world. Today, we have explorers who continue to push the boundaries of human knowledge and adventurers who travel the world in search of new experiences. The Vikings were a complex and fascinating people who were far from the mindless berserkers that they often portrayed, as they were skilled mariners, traders, artists, and explorers who had a profound impact on the world around them. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just think of brutal warriors. Remember the merchants, the explorers, the artists, and all the other people who made the Viking Age such a remarkable period in history. So there you have it, a brief overview of the fascinating history of the Vikings. We've talked about their ships, their society, their art, and their legacy. But there's so much more to learn about these amazing people. If you want to know more about the Vikings, then check out the resources in the description below. Who knows, you might just find yourself hooked on Viking history, like so many others before you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep learning.